7 miles down in total darkness, nothing should be producing oxygen. No sunlight reaches that far, no plants exist to make it. Then a marine scientist running routine seafloor experiments picked up readings his own equipment wasn't built to explain, in a place government agencies had written off decades earlier. He checked it for 10 years before telling anyone. What he found is still being argued about today. The dive that scared everyone away. On January 23, 1960, two men climbed into a steel diving vessel called the Trieste and dropped into Challenger Deep, the lowest known point of the Mariana Trench. Jacques Piccard and U.S. Navy Lieutenant Don Walsh spent almost 5 hours sinking nearly 7 miles. About 30,000 feet into the descent, the outer window of the vessel cracked. The whole submersible shook. They kept going anyway because turning back at that depth was barely an option. They reached the bottom at 10,911 meters. The pressure outside their tiny cabin was crushing enough to flatten a truck many times over. They stayed only 20 minutes before the damaged window forced them back up. They reported seeing what looked like a flatfish resting on the seafloor, a detail scientists have argued about for decades since, because nothing was supposed to survive a pressure that extreme. No camera on board could confirm the sighting either way, which only added more fuel to the argument in the decades that followed. That single dive proved humans could reach and survive the deepest place on the planet. It also proved how easily it could have gone wrong. A cracked window at that depth means total structural failure within seconds, not a small leak. The two men who saw the bottom of the ocean almost never made it back up to tell anyone what they found. That near disaster is exactly why nobody rushed to repeat the trip, and what followed was not more exploration at all. The long silence that followed. After 1960, nobody returned to Challenger Deep for 52 years. The reason was not a lack of curiosity. It was money, risk, and timing, all working against the trench at once. Building a vehicle that can survive 8 tons of pressure pressing on every square inch is one of the hardest engineering problems on Earth. The Trieste was retired not long after its historic dive. A new vehicle capable of repeating that trip would have cost tens of millions of dollars, with no guarantee it would even work on the first attempt. At the same time, the United States was pouring its science budget and public attention into the space race. Landing on the moon offered astronauts on live television and a clear finish line everyone could understand. Going back into the ocean offered none of that, and if anything failed at that depth, there was no rescue possible. Government funding for crewed deep trench missions dried up almost completely. Robotic submersibles slowly improved and explored shallower trenches and ridges during those decades, including unmanned vehicles like Japan's Keiko, but the deepest point on the planet still sat essentially untouched by direct human observation for over half a century. Even those robotic missions carried heavy risk, since a single design flaw at that depth could destroy an unmanned vehicle just as easily as a crewed one. It took someone completely outside government science, with their own money and their own reasons, to finally break that long silence. The filmmaker who went back down. In March 2012, filmmaker and explorer James Cameron piloted a submersible called the Deep Sea Challenger Solo to the bottom of Challenger Deep. He spent close to 3 hours on the seafloor, longer than anyone before him had stayed at that depth. The vehicle was built and funded largely through his own resources and private partnerships, since government agencies were not lining up to pay for another attempt. During that same expedition, researchers dropped a separate lander into a nearby stretch of the trench called Serena Deep, at a depth of about 10,677 meters. Cameras and sampling gear on that lander picked up strange, stringy coatings clinging to rock on the seafloor. Scientists later identified these as microbial mats, dense clumps of single-celled organisms that appeared to be feeding off chemical energy released by the surrounding rock, rather than sunlight, or nutrients drifting down from above. The same expedition also collected tens of thousands of microbes from water, sediment, and even from inside small shrimp like creatures called amphipods, with DNA analysis later identifying more than 70 species that had never been documented before. Researchers connected the mat discovery to a process called serpentinization, where seawater reacts with certain mantle rock and releases hydrogen that some microbes can use as fuel. This may be one of the deepest known chemosynthetic communities on Earth, surviving with no connection to sunlight at all. That single discovery, made almost by accident on a lander drop, ended up mattering far beyond the trench itself. And it was not the last strange thing researchers would pull out of that water. The oil-eating bacteria that made no sense. A few years after Cameron's dive, researchers analyzing water and sediment samples pulled from deep inside the trench found something that did not match any existing model of ocean life. Samples collected from depths below 10,400 meters near the bottom of Challenger Deep showed an unexpected explosion of bacteria that specialize in breaking down hydrocarbons, the same kind of oil-eating microbes usually associated with cleanup work at oil spill sites. Their findings were published in the journal Microbiome in 2019. The bacteria involved mainly belonged to three genera: Olibacter, Thalassolitus, and Alcanivorax, all known for species that consume the kind of hydrocarbons found in crude oil. What genuinely surprised the researchers was the concentration. The proportion of hydrocarbon-degrading bacteria at those depths turned out to be the highest ever recorded in any natural environment on Earth. Higher than actual oil spill zones and higher than soil deliberately contaminated with petroleum for lab study. Researchers even isolated live strains from that water and confirmed in the lab that they could still break down oil compounds under pressure conditions built to copy the deep trench itself. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Nobody had a clean explanation for where that much organic material was coming from at a depth with no sunlight and no plant life. Sediment samples contain naturally occurring hydrocarbons, whose chemical signature pointed toward a source inside the trench itself, not from above. That gap kept scientists curious for years, and it turned out to be only the first of two discoveries that would challenge a much older assumption about life in total darkness. The oxygen that broke a rule. No one questioned. Biology has followed one unbroken rule for over a century. Oxygen comes from photosynthesis, and photosynthesis requires sunlight. Roughly half of every breath a person takes was produced by tiny phytoplankton near the ocean surface, and the rest came from plants on land. Without light reaching a location, there should be no new oxygen being made there at all. Professor Andrew Sweetman at the Scottish Association for Marine Science first noticed something wrong with his own measurements back in 2013. He was running experiments in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, a stretch of the deep Pacific seafloor roughly 4,000 meters down, placing sealed chambers on the seafloor and tracking oxygen levels inside them over time. In a place with no sunlight, oxygen should slowly disappear as organisms inside the chamber breathe it in. The readings should have dropped. Instead, they rose, and rose significantly. Over 2 days of measurement, oxygen levels inside the sealed chambers climbed to more than 3 times the surrounding background level. Sweetman assumed it was instrument error at first, had the equipment recalibrated, and ran the test again. The oxygen kept rising anyway. After close to a decade of repeated testing across multiple expeditions, his team published the results in Nature Geoscience in 2024, pointing to small potato-sized rocks called polymetallic nodules, rich in manganese, cobalt, and nickel, as the likely source. These nodules carry a measurable electric charge, with voltages recorded up to 0.95 volts on a single rock, close to 2/3 the charge of a standard AA battery. The team proposed this natural charge might be strong enough to split seawater into hydrogen and oxygen through a purely chemical process with no biology involved. That single claim was enough to send other scientists straight into the data looking for holes, and what followed became one of the tensest arguments in ocean science today. The fight that still hasn't ended. The dark oxygen paper did not sit quietly for long. Companies planning to mine those same nodules for their metal content, including one firm that had helped fund part of the original research, publicly pushed back on the findings. Other scientists questioned whether the voltages measured on the nodules were even strong enough to split water molecules apart, and pointed to gaps in the original experiment, including a lack of proper control chambers run without any nodules present. A detailed critique making these arguments was published in Frontiers in Marine Science in 2025. The dispute only deepened from there. Sweetman later acknowledged that some of the original equipment used in the study did not actually contain full manganese nodules, only smaller grains of manganese oxide, a detail critics say weakens the link between nodules and the oxygen readings. Nature Geoscience posted an editor's note in 2026 stating that parts of the original paper remain under continued review, and some scientists have called for it to be retracted outright, arguing the finding conflicts with basic thermodynamics. The disagreement even reached international policy circles, with the discovery raised during a session of the International Seabed Authority as regulators weighed future rules for deep-sea mining. Sweetman's team has stood by its core measurements and pointed to a planned follow-up expedition meant to settle the argument with fresh data. That debate remains open, with no side able to fully close the case. What has not been explained away is the readings themselves, repeated for a decade and checked by multiple outside scientists, and that unresolved gap is exactly why a space agency has been watching this corner of ocean science so closely. Why a space agency cares about the ocean floor. Jupiter has a moon called Europa. Saturn has a moon called Enceladus. Both moons are believed to hide liquid oceans beneath thick shells of ice, with no sunlight reaching them at all. Enceladus has already been directly observed venting water vapor through cracks in its surface, meaning its hidden ocean is actively interacting with the rock beneath it right now. Scientists believe both moons may have hydrothermal activity on their seafloors, hot water mixing with rock in total darkness, similar to vent systems found deep in Earth's oceans. To prepare for future missions to these moons, NASA needed a real-world stand-in for that kind of environment, since nobody can send a probe to Europa just to test an idea. A NASA-led program called Subsea, working with NOAA and the Ocean Exploration Trust, sent researchers to study underwater volcanoes and vent systems whose pressure, temperature, and chemistry closely resemble predictions for the Enceladus seafloor. Researchers have separately pointed to the microbial mats found at Serena Deep as a possible glimpse of what life in a similarly sunless ocean might look like. Some studies of the wider Mariana Trench have also found that nearly 9 out of every 10 microbial types collected there still cannot be matched to any known species, meaning most of what lives down there remains completely unclassified even today. The logic is straightforward. The smartest place to build a search strategy for a moon hundreds of millions of miles away is the most extreme ocean environment available right here on Earth. The bacteria at Challenger Deep and the disputed oxygen readings from the wider Pacific floor were not just strange local puzzles. They became reference points for what a future spacecraft might need to look for on a completely different world, and that connection is the whole reason this trench keeps getting mentioned in conversations about outer space. What it all adds up to. Line up the timeline and a clear pattern shows up. One crude dive in 1960 nearly ended in disaster and scared away any quick follow-up for 52 years. A filmmaker broke that silence in 2012 and stumbled onto microbial life clinging to rock in total darkness. Researchers then found oil-eating bacteria in concentrations never recorded anywhere else on the planet, followed by oxygen readings that challenged a rule biology had relied on for generations, a claim still being argued over right now. None of this is speculation. The findings came from Microbiome in 2019, Nature Geoscience in 2024, a published rebuttal in 2025, and NASA's own subsea research. Fewer than a handful of crewed missions have ever reached the true bottom of the Mariana Trench in the entire history of exploration. The reasons exploration slowed were never about losing interest. They were about cost, risk, and timing working against the trench again and again, and what little was found down there was strange enough to send a space agency looking for clues about a moon nobody has ever set foot on. If this video gave you something, subscribing takes 3 seconds and it helps us keep making content like this.